So thanks everyone for joining us today. I can see we have 55 people joining the seminar group, and it is my pleasure to introduce Josh Cinner, many of whom you already know. Josh and I have been working together for a number of years here, and there's plenty of things I could comment on about how much of a great working relationship it's been. But I think one of the things that we all probably could aspire to do, which Josh has done, is pulling together such a large data set through years and years of investment and wrangling cats to really start looking at these big issues across coral reefs, but throughout the world. And some of the work that he's going to talk to us about today is directly related to this massive effort that he's done. And Josh, how many years now have you been running this SERF program?
Well, it sort of started in around 2007, but some of the data that I'll be presenting today goes right back to 2001.
Right. And I mean, I think it's just such a great thing to see, and I think everyone will appreciate the amount of effort required to produce some of the work and how long it really takes to come out. And I know you have another paper that you're just about to release tomorrow from the same data set. So without further ado, I will leave it to you, Josh. Thanks for making the time. And if anybody has questions, if we have time at the end, use the comments or on the side, and we'll try to get to them.
Great, thanks, Brock. So what I wanted to do today is tie together the kind of various strands of research on bright spots that my group and I have been working on over the last few years. So some of you may have heard or read various pieces of what I'll be presenting today, but what I hope is the interesting bit for those folks that have seen some bits of it is the kind of big picture on how a lot of this all fits together, at least as I see it. Okay, so scientists often spend their careers looking at averages and trends, and this is often really important for discerning the signal from the noise, right? It's how we know, for example, that the ocean, the globe is slowly warming. Well, maybe not so slowly, but the globe is warming despite the fact that in some places in the winter you can still make snowballs, right? But today I'm going to highlight an approach to informing coral reef conservation that's focused on identifying and learning from outliers, and specifically outliers that are doing well despite difficult conditions. Now, by their very nature, outliers deviate from our expectations, and consequently, they can provide novel insights into confronting complex problems where conventional solutions have failed. And the classic example of this comes from Save the Children in Vietnam. And this is an NGO that was working on the nexus between poverty and childhood malnutrition. And as you can imagine, these two issues are very tightly coupled, with poorer children tending to be more malnourished than their wealthier counterparts. What Save the Children did that I thought was very insightful and inspirational was they identified what they called the bright spots. They were the poor children that were not malnourished. And they wanted to find out what was different about what were they doing differently. So they went and they asked their mothers what their mothers were doing differently from other mothers in the village. And it turns out they were doing a few things. And these include finding little crab and shrimp in the rice paddies and grinding these up and putting them in the rice. They were also feeding their kids 3 times a day instead of the standard 2 times. Now, they weren't giving their kids more food. They couldn't afford to, right? But by breaking the meals up into smaller portions throughout the day, the children were better able to absorb the nutrients within. Now, Save the Children then had these mothers teach other mothers in the village how to do this, and then had these villages become living laboratories for mothers from other villages. They ended up cutting childhood malnutrition by 65% in project villages and reached 2.2 million households, right? So this type of positive deviance or bright spots analysis has been used in fields such as business and health and human development to uncover local actions and governance systems that work in the context of widespread failure. And it holds much promise in informing conservation. So we use this approach to examine reefs that, for all intents and purposes, should have been degraded, but weren't, and to see what we could learn about what they were doing differently. So here's the way that today's talk is going to be kind of structured. So the first part, I'll sort of talk about kind of defining the expectations, right? The second part, and I'll give a little spoiler alert here. One of the key things that we found was that markets were playing a really important role in sort of shaping coral reefs, coral reef fish communities. And so I'm going to do a little bit of a kind of a detour into the research program that I've kind of launched in response to this. And so we'll kind of go through some of the stuff. This will be pretty weird for most of you, and so hopefully just hang on. Hopefully you won't think I've lost my mind by the time we're through this part. It's some of the research is really on the fringes of behavioral economics and social psychology, but it really, I think, ties it in quite nicely. Then we're going to move into locating bright spots, and then we'll learn a little bit more about kind of what makes a bright spot bright. So let's go into this defining expectations. So to do this, as Brock mentioned, a number of years ago, I assembled a team of what we call the Social-Ecological Research Frontiers Working Group. It's an interdisciplinary group of about 40 scientists, including geographers and ecologists and economists and environmental scientists, ecologists, engineers, and statisticians. And you know, it was these issues are too big for any, I think, one discipline to solve. And so it really took this type of interdisciplinary collaboration. And you know, I take this sort of interdisciplinarity very seriously. And although I didn't marry an ecologist, I did get married by one and have a number of them in my wedding party. But we ended up establishing, or we ended up compiling data from about 7,000 surveys across 2,500 reef sites in 45 countries, states, and territories. And just to be clear, this is the largest study of this kind that's been conducted. At each site, we looked at different indicators of ecosystem conditions, right? These include fish biomass, the presence of top predators, the amount of parrotfish grazing that was there, and a metric of trait diversity. Now, 99% of what I'll be talking about today is really focused on reef fish biomass. And this is a kind of nice indicator for both social scientists and ecologists, I think, because it has meaning among both disciplines. You know, it reflects a broad selection of ecological functions, but also it represents a kind of what's available for people to, well, kill and eat. So here's a map of the distributions, the kind of the observed data, the map of the distribution of biomass among our study sites, with the smaller red dots meaning there's no fish there, and the big green dots meaning that there's a lot of fish there. Now, I think there's two important points here. And the first is that the median amount of biomass on a fished reef we found was about slightly under 400 kilograms per hectare. Now that number in and of itself doesn't mean anything unless you have a reference point or a benchmark. Now, in a study a few years back, we calculated that reference point, that benchmark, and for given average conditions, unfished biomass is about 1,000 kilograms per hectare. Now, basic fishery science would say that maximum sustainable yield occurs at half of unfished biomass, which is about 500 kilograms per hectare. So what we're seeing is the majority of coral reefs in the world are overfished, right? That's the first part. But the second point, I think, in looking at the observed data is that there's a lot of variability there. And so what we wanted to do was predict that variability, right? We wanted to predict the amount of fish on a reef based on both social and environmental conditions, right? So we constructed a Bayesian hierarchical model that predicted reef fish biomass as a function of key environmental variables and key social drivers. So the environmental conditions, these are the things that I'm personally not interested in. I think of as my nuisance parameters, but these included things like productivity, depth, what was the habitat, the benthos, the sampling, what technique was used, how much area did they sample, and a metric of connectivity to other reefs. We looked at a range of larger scale socioeconomic drivers, including a metric of the Human Development Index, which is a metric compiled that looks at things like education and lifespan and GDP to measure people's sort of well-being or quality of life. The inverse of this would be poverty. We looked at national population size, a World Bank governance index of voice and accountability. We looked at the amount of reef fish landings in a country and a metric of tourism relative to national populations. We also looked at a range of local scale socioeconomic drivers. So we looked at what was the type of management in place on that reef. And we looked at the levels of compliance with that management too. We looked at a metric of population growth. So in the surrounding area of that reef, how quickly or slowly was the human population growing, right? We looked at a metric of local pressure, which I'll describe in a moment. But the interesting finding, I think, the last one that we looked at was a metric of potential market interactions. Now, I think one of the key findings from this study really was that the strongest predictor of reef fish biomass was our metric of potential market interactions. And not only did it predict reef fish biomass, but it also predicted the presence of top predators, the amount of parrotfish grazing that was on a reef, and our metric of trait diversity. Quite simply, potential market interactions were the most consistent socioeconomic predictor of ecological, and when I say ecological, I'm just specifically talking about fish conditions on coral reefs. So now I kind of want to dive into this a little bit and talk for a little while specifically about the role of markets and what might be done. So the way that we measured markets is something that all of you should be familiar with every minute of every day, and it's a term called gravity. And if you remember from high school physics, the gravitational pull that something exerts is its mass divided by the distance squared, right? Well, since the 1880s, economists have used gravity, which they also call interactance, to predict trade and migration flows among cities and countries. And it's often called the most successful model in economics. So we developed a gravity metric which captures potential market interactions with reefs based on the size, right, population size of the market, which is analogous to the mass, and the accessibility, which is analogous to the distance of the nearest market. And by accessibility, what we used was the travel time. How long would it take to get there, given the terrain and the roads and the boats? And this essentially is designed to measure the potential gravitational pull of markets on reefs. So let's take a look at what the relationship looks like. So on this axis, we go from low market pressure to high market pressure. And on this axis, we go from basically there being no fish to there being lots of fish. So what we see is obviously the amount of fish on a reef declines, and there's 4 times more fish on reefs that are far from markets than on fish that are near markets. So this is particularly important, I think, because markets are expanding globally, including into previously remote areas. For example, late last year, Indonesia announced that it was going to move the capital city from Jakarta to a remote part of Borneo, which looks like a little village crossroads there. That's going to be the new Indonesian capital. Likewise, in the South China Sea, they're building up previously remote atolls into bases that potentially could have civilian populations as well. And if you haven't heard of China's Belt and Road Initiative, you've not been paying attention. This is the largest human infrastructure project in human history. They are reorienting global trade routes through China, right? They're going to build 3 Silk Roads between China and Europe, and also develop new maritime Silk Roads with massive investments in ports. Okay, so we know that markets are having a big role on reef ecosystems, but what can we do to reduce or dampen their effect? And this requires understanding how markets can lead to exploitation. And the standard sort of economic paradigm, which is quite well established, and I buy it, by the way, is that price and price variability, right, changes in price, can create incentives for overexploitation. and this can lead to the degradation. However, it's what we're just now learning that is much more interesting, and where I believe the potential for fundamental change lies. There's an emerging body of research in the fringes of both behavioral economics and philosophy that's beginning to study how the very presence of markets changes the way that humans behave. And this can have big impacts on the environment. Let me explain. Much of human behavior is governed by social norms that determine what a society thinks is acceptable or not. And what we're finding out is that the introduction of markets can displace or crowd out these social norms, potentially leading to unforeseen or perverse consequences. Now, let me give you guys an example that has nothing to do with the environment, but many of you may be able to relate to. So this is my little boy Ezra, and he, as of a couple of weeks ago, was going to daycare. That's all changed recently. But many daycare facilities around the world have a problem with parents being late to pick up their children. Well, in Israel, some daycare centers decided to do something about it and impose a fine for being late. So when they did that, as it turns out, the incidence of late pickups nearly doubled. What happened? Well, prior to the fines, social norms made parents feel bad for picking up their children late. Now, it didn't work perfectly, of course, but it did make parents want to go and pick up their kids. But the fines created the idea of compensation for the extra time, displacing this ethical obligation to be on time. Now, a few dollars extra to enjoy that latte is totally worth it. It's just the cost of daycare, right? Importantly, though, 3 weeks later, when those fines were reversed, the elevated rate of late pickups persisted. Once eroded, these moral obligations were hard to revive. So we know that markets can affect 3 areas of human behavior that have direct relevance to conservation. Right? And one of the most important ways that markets can crowd out sort of pro-environmental behavior is by reducing people's propensity to engage in collective action or civic duties. And I'll give you guys another example that also comes from Israel and also isn't directly related to conservation, but I think it will help illustrate it quite nicely. So every year in Israel, children take 1 day, school children take 1 day off, and they go collect money for charity, right? Well, some behavioral economists decided to get involved, and they divided these children into 3 groups. Those that just went and collected the money as they normally do, but then they decided to have 2 other groups, one where they gave them a 1% commission, and the other where they gave them a 10% commission, right? So as it turns out, the group that raised the most money was the group that didn't get paid at all, right? And so what happened in this case, though, was that the money crowded out the norms of civic duty. It changed the character of the activity from a good deed into a job for pay, right? But as it turns out, what was interesting is that the group that did the best was the group that got nothing. Then the group that did the worst was the one that got 1%, and the group that got 10% was kind of in between. So the authors were kind of cheeky, and the title of the paper was something like, if you're going to pay someone, make sure you pay it enough. But in this instance, the markets merely commodifying this service was enough to erode it. So emerging research also suggests that markets can affect people's willingness to inflict indirect harm on others. And this is what economists often refer to as negative or third-party externalities. And markets can also affect people's preferences for social equity or fairness. Now, critically, some of these, in particular collective action, right, are the very foundations of most community-based approaches to conservation. And these can be undermined by markets in ways that we're simply not paying attention to. And even worse, there's a whole branch of conservation called market-based instruments that create new markets in the provision of environmental goods or in the avoidance of environmental harm, right? How ironic that these market-based conservation instruments could be eroding the very foundations of conservation itself. So, I think the key question is whether and how we can prevent the potential displacement of collective action and preferences for equity and intolerance for externalities, right? So doing so first understands what are the mechanisms through which this type of crowding out happens. And one of the mechanisms we've described a little bit already is displacing internal motivations by external motivations. Well, another is this notion of diffusion of responsibility, right? It's called moral free riding. And essentially what it says is if people are dealing with kind of one-on-one transactions, they feel responsible for things. But in a market context where there's a lot of anonymous buyers and sellers, people don't feel that same responsibility. It becomes diffuse among the different elements of the supply chain. And so we call this moral free riding. But there's also the third mechanism that's widely proposed is this notion of framing, and that choices are influenced by different wordings and settings and situations. Right? So the question I'd ask then is, are there ways to couple countermeasures into conservation? Are there ways in which we can foster intrinsic motivations or reinforce individual responsibility when we're developing conservation initiatives, particularly market-based conservation initiatives? So my research group has looked at the role of framing in collective action or civic duty. And so what we did is we used a public goods game to measure cooperation. And this is my former postdoc, Christian Rojas. And one of the interesting things we did is we played, and I'll describe to you guys in a moment just what a public goods game is, but we played a public goods game in a fishing village in Papua New Guinea. Now, these types of economic experimental games are often done in laboratory settings in either North America or Europe. And so there's very strong questions about whether the results that are gleaned from these experiments in very unique settings, they're typically among wealthy white college students, whether those are applicable in places like Papua New Guinea. So we took these sorts of games and applied them in fishing villages in New Guinea. And so let me describe to you what the public goods game is very briefly. And so typically you have a range of players. In this illustrative example, we've got 3, and they get a kitty of money to begin with. And if they choose, they can contribute to a public good. So in this example, let's say everyone gives $6, right, to the public good. That means there's 18 bucks there. What then happens is that public good grows. So typically, for example, we doubled it, right? So that grew, and then we distributed it back evenly among the players, irrespective of their initial contribution, right? So in this case, everyone gets back 12 bucks, and they're all stoked, right? But let's take another example here where player 1 gives $6, but player 2 and 3 are cheapskates. So that then grows and then gets distributed evenly among the players. And so player 1 is feeling like a sucker, but players 2 and 3 are stoked. So this is the type of game we played, but we did it with a twist. And we had 3 treatments. So we had a control, treatment 1, and treatment 2. So preceding treatment 1, we played what's called a trust game. And preceding treatment 2, we played what's called a market game. And these were to do the framing. This was the framing. Now, I won't bore you with the details of the trust game and the market game, but it was all about framing them. And then we looked at people's contributions to the public goods, whether they were in the control group, or the 2 different treatments, to see if they were different. And what we found, which really kind of surprised us, is that framing did have a big impact on cooperation, but it actually depended on which role was played in each game. The market game and the trust game by themselves didn't have any influence on the contributions to the public goods game, but that's because there's actually different roles. In the market game, you've got buyers and sellers, and in the trust game, right, you've got senders and receivers. And both of these roles had very polar opposite effects, which canceled each other out in the overall framing, but individually, there was big effects from the role that you played in the trust game or the role that you played in the market game. And so if people are interested in this, it's been accepted in ecological economics and should be coming out in the next, hopefully, few weeks. Okay, so let's move back to our sort of our bright spots work, and let's talk about sort of locating the bright spots. Where were they? So just to kind of revisit, we defined bright spots as places that are doing better than expected, given the socioeconomic and environmental conditions they're exposed to. In short, they're deviations after having accounted for our covariates. And we use 2 standard deviations from expectations as a very conservative definition of an outlier. And if you guys remember from your first stats class, 1 standard deviation is where about 2/3 of the data lie, and 2 standard deviations where about 95% of the data lie. So we were looking for things that were behaving very differently than most. Now, we found that the bright spots were concentrated in the Pacific, right? And they occurred in both remote and in populated areas, right? Including Tabaweran, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and parts of Indonesia. Now, what I want to point out though is that our bright spots, this was a relative measure, not absolute. So our bright spots weren't just remote, pristine places, right? Some had biomass levels that were below the global mean. We also looked at dark spots, and these were what I would consider the paths to avoid. These were places that were doing worse than expected, given the conditions they were exposed to. So, what I kind of like about this approach is that I think it helps challenge our expectations. And, the Caribbean is often considered the basket case for the world's coral reefs, because the reefs are very degraded and fish populations are severely overfished. But, interestingly, what we found was we only found 2 dark spots in the Caribbean, right? And what that means is, given the conditions there, right, given the social and environmental conditions there, the ecological conditions are almost entirely predictable. Now, the funny thing is the dark spot that's there in Jamaica literally happens to be in the marine park that I spent 2 years in as a Peace Corps volunteer from 96 to 98. So I'm really kind of hoping that nothing about that being a dark spot has anything to do with my couple of years trying to make things better there. We often do make things worse with good intentions. But the other expectation and challenges is we often think of remote reefs as kind of being, what we call conservation hotspots, which I would differentiate from bright spots. But what we found was even some remote reefs were doing worse than we'd expect, given the conditions they were exposed to. For example, in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, given the fact that it's in a marine reserve thousands of miles from the nearest person in a wealthy country with funds to manage it, we would have expected those to be doing better. Okay, so let's now move on to the last part of this talk, which is really what makes a bright spot bright. And previous research from sort of agricultural economics has found there's sort of 3 broad categories of conditions that can lead to bright spots, including environmental, social and institutional, and technological conditions. So we use these as a basis for exploring to try to uncover why bright and dark spots may diverge from expectations. Oh boy, my battery is just about to die. Give me a second. It is actually plugged in. Sorry about this, guys. Give me 1 second. Michelle, could you grab a power plug really, really quickly? My battery's about to die in the middle of this talk. Thanks. Sorry about that, folks. It is actually plugged in, but it seems to not be working. So hopefully this will self-organize before it dies. So we asked our our data providers about different conditions, environmental, social, institutional, and technological, in our bright spots, in 15 bright spots, in 35 dark spots, and in 14 average sites, places where biomass values closely match closely to model expectations. So in terms of the environmental conditions, we found that bright spots were more likely to have deep water refuges, and dark spots were more likely to have environmental shocks, to have suffered from environmental shocks. And this could include a bleaching event or a cyclone. And I think this latter finding is particularly worrisome given the context of global environmental change. Thank you. We found that dark spots were more likely to use intensive netting that could damage the sort of coral habitat architecture that provides habitat for a lot of fish. And they were also more likely to have freezers where they could stockpile fish to send to markets. Now, in terms of the social conditions, we found that bright spots were more likely to have high levels of dependence on reef resources. And this finding seems a little bit counterintuitive because people would often say, well, shouldn't they have lower levels of dependence? Wouldn't that make more sense? But decades of research into common property institutions suggests that where people's livelihoods depends on resources, they're more willing to invest in creative solutions to solve these problems. We also found there were higher levels of engagement by local people in the reef management process, and there were strong cultural practices or connections to the sea. These were much more prevalent in bright spots. So what I want to do in the kind of last part of the talk is kind of transition and do a kind of a deep dive into two of these key features, particularly high levels of engagement and cultural practices and connections. And this is from a 16-year data set that we published in PNAS right before Christmas with a number of people from my research group and also a number of center alumni as well. And it kind of takes a really deep dive because one of the bright spots, rather serendipitously, happened to be somewhere that I'd been working since 2001. And it's an island off of the Madang province of Papua New Guinea called Karkar Island. And particularly we worked on the east coast, on the east side of Karkar Island in two villages, in Maluk and in Wadao. So as I mentioned, I've been collecting social and ecological data there since 2001. And this community employs a rotational closure system where they close the reefs from about 2 to 7 years at a time. Now, it's practiced by a neighboring community as well. So there's two communities and they both practice it. So this creates kind of interesting design for us. And so let me just explain it. So in 2001, when we went, the reefs in front of the Maluk village were closed to fishing, and the reefs in front of the Wadao village were open to fishing, right? In 2009, when we went back, the reefs in front of Maluk were still closed, right? And the reefs in front of Wadao were open. When we went back in 2012, the reefs in front of Maluk were open, but the reefs in front of Wadao were closed. When we went back in 2016, the reefs in front of Maluk were closed to fishing, but the reefs in front of Wadao were open. And then in 2017, all the reefs were open to fishing, right? Now, what we found was there was double the biomass of fish when the reefs were closed to fishing relative to when they were open to fishing. But interestingly, that is not why they were doing it. The main goal of the closure was actually to change fish behavior to make fishing easier. Right, so we actually studied this, and one of my former students, Fraser, he actually spent quite a bit of time measuring how close you could get to a fish before it swam off, and this is called approach distance or flight initiation distance. And what we found was in 2000, when the reefs in front of Maluk went from being closed to fishing to being open to fishing, right, the distance, the flight initiation distance increased from 8 to 11.5 feet, right? In Wadao, when the opposite happened, when flight initiation distance decreased from 13 to 9 feet when fishing was forbidden. Now, what I think is a really interesting part to this is that, well, of course, fish were flightier when fishing was allowed, but the interesting thing is that the average spearfishing distance, given the equipment that they use, is about 10 feet, right? So the fish stay just out of range. But if you take a pause on fishing for a while, the fish behavior changes quite a bit, right? And you can get a lot closer. And what that means is when you lift the restrictions, right, the fishers can clean up, and they did, right? So every clan there was responsible for going and collecting a lot of fish for a ceremony that they held to mark the opening of the reef. And so there was a lot of high social prestige from this because they would invite other neighboring villages. And for them, so in Melanesia, your wealth is not judged by what you own. Your wealth is judged by what you give away. And so for this community to be able to give food, to gift food to other villages was a very powerful measure of social prestige. Now, one of the interesting things we found was people's perceptions of how the closure benefited people's livelihoods, right? And so this is just a kind of a Likert scale here that we see. And so about 65% of the community in Malouk in 2009 had a positive view of these closures. They felt like it was beneficial for their livelihoods. About 10% were slightly negative. They said it was not great for them. And about 25% were neutral. They said it wasn't good, it wasn't bad. Now, interestingly, and again, I'll note that that's when the reefs were closed, right? You couldn't go fishing there. Now, when we went back in 2012 and we resurveyed them, right? What we found was there was a higher proportion of the community that thought it was good, and all of the negative perceptions had gone away. Now, interestingly, in Wandao that year, the reefs were closed. And what we found was there was a small minority of negative perceptions there, similar proportion of positive perceptions, but those negative perceptions. Then when we went back again in 2016, right, when Malouk's reefs were closed, there was negative perceptions on that. But Wadao's reefs, which were now open, there was no negative perceptions going on. What the hell is going on here? Well, I think what's happening has some insights from social psychology, right? Again, these negative perceptions only happen when the closure is active. So this can be explained by variation of what's called the peak end rule, or what Danny Kahneman called duration neglect. And this means that this refers to the idea that there's a distinction between what people experience and what they remember, right? People tend to often only remember the ending of things like meal or pain. And when these are pleasant, they have fonder memories, regardless of the duration, right? Now, the example that Kahneman used to come up with this theory comes from a rather uncomfortable topic, colonoscopies. He was working with healthcare professionals to try to figure out how you could get patients to go back for follow-up visits after the colonoscopy, because what they were finding was once you give a patient a colonoscopy, he never wants to see that doctor again. He's very unlikely to come back for any visits. So they were thinking, well, how could we, they asked Kahneman if they could help them increase the revisitation rates of their patients. So what Kahneman did was interesting. He said, okay, so do the procedure, but then when you're done, leave the scope up there, but don't move it for an additional 30 seconds. So just leave it alone there, right? Now, the colonoscopy is entirely unpleasant, and even having a large scope up there apparently is unpleasant, but it's not as unpleasant when it doesn't move, right? So what he found was the patients that had this extra long procedure, right? The whole main procedure was still the same, but they also had it left in for longer. Those patients recalled the entire experience as being more pleasant and were much more likely to come back for follow-up visits. Now, this led to an ethical dilemma for the doctors as well, right? Because the Hippocratic rule is first, do no harm. And so there's a moral dilemma here, because you're actually doing your patients more harm by leaving it in, right? Because that's paying their experience over a longer period of time. But are you also doing more good by getting them to come back for follow-up visits, which may result in cancer treatment? And so anyway, that's how we explain this this only negative perceptions when it was there. And that's because we think that this opening was marked by a large harvest of event, which kind of gave people this pleasant experience at the end of it. Their fishing was better, and they had this big memorable experience. So one of the last things we did was we asked the local community members, why did they think their site was a bright spot? What made their village different from other villages, right? This was analogous to, in the beginning of this talk, I talked about how Save the Children asked the mothers what they were doing differently from other mothers. We asked key informants in these communities what they were doing differently from other communities, what made them different from other communities. And they talked about 4 broad themes, right? And one was that they had a range of unique customs. This rotational closure was one, but they also had a fishing initiation ceremony for young men in the village. And this is kind of being recreated here for our pleasure. And this type of fishing is called bomb. And they go out at night. There's one man paddles and one man holds a torch, and they actually spear flying fish and long tom that come up that get drawn to the flame. But not everyone can do this. You can only do this if you've been initiated, and you only get selected for initiation if you behave properly. And we'll get into that in just a second. But also they noted that the entire system was kind of enabled by property rights and tenure. They are able to exclude outsiders from fishing in their village. They've got a property rights system, unlike the sort of common property system in Australia. They also talked a lot about compliance, and they used what I would call, or what I called, a carrot and a stick approach to compliance, where people that followed the rules were rewarded, and particularly young men that followed the rules were rewarded through being allowed to be initiated into the bonbon ceremony, and they had access to this whole type of fishery and all the knowledge that comes with that, and the social prestige that comes with that. But they also used a stick approach to compliance as well, and transgressors were publicly called out. So they leveraged our fear of social shame in the small village, and they would call out transgressors in the weekly public meetings. They also talked about high levels of participation, and that decision-making was adaptive, right? They didn't have a date in which the closure was going to begin or when it was going to open. This was done through consensus and discussions, right? And they also had social gatherings. Every Monday was meeting day. So they would meet, they would have a community meeting every Monday. And lastly, they talked about really strong social capital. And this was one of the key things that they talked about a lot, though, was having very strong youth-elder ties. And we actually tested this by looking at information exchange social networks. And we found that these were very tight, and indeed, there was a lot of transfer between youth and elders that we don't typically see in many other fishing communities. And I guess the important point here, though, is that all of these things reinforce each other, right? The compliance is helped by having the unique customs and also the strong social capital, right? So, okay, so moving forward, where is this sort of stuff going for me and our research group? Well, I've become very interested in how we could leverage insights, behavioral insights for conservation, right? So things like the peak end rule. How can we use insights about social norms and the ways that people behave to inform conservation? And so in 2018, I was asked to write a perspective in science about this. The next thing that I think, the next thing that my research group is really focusing on is moving kind of from bright spots to exceptional responders. And this is, I think, particularly important given the global bleaching events that we've had, and also the COVID-19 crisis. And so let me just explain what an exceptional responder is. So in oncology, there is a small minority of patients, so less than 10% of patients, will have just remarkable responses to drug therapy that other patients don't have. This is often because they have a specific genetic mutation, right? And when they do, though, any patient that has that genetic mutation then may be applicable to have this sort of cancer treatment. So it may not treat everyone, but it may treat a certain subset. But we not only learn more about, we not only create a little bit of a cure there, we can also learn more about both cancer and human physiology from this. So in 2017, Harvard launched a network of enigmatic exceptional responders to systematically study exceptional responders in medicine. And what I'm interested in doing, and particularly Ian's been working on compiling the database for this, is we're going to apply the same sort of principle for coral reefs, looking at the sort of global bleaching events and the COVID crisis, and trying to understand which reefs are recovering remarkably, which are doing worse, and what are the conditions that make that possible. Okay, so just a few brief take-home messages. First, I think we need to embrace a broader range of potential policy levers. Markets were the strongest socioeconomic driver of change on reefs globally, and I think there's opportunities here to broaden conservation, to take a much stronger focus on markets, and particularly to dampen the role of markets by coupling conservation with countermeasures. Again, there's the potential to learn from places that have effectively confronted strong drivers of change. The specific practice that we studied, this rotational closure system in Karkar Island, mightn't be applicable everywhere, but I do think there was transferable lessons there, right? There was benefits of having a system of property rights. There's benefits to encouraging participation, and there's opportunities to leverage social norms to encourage more pro-environmental practices. And the last sort of take-home message I would give from this is that there's a need to work together. This type of research that I've been doing couldn't be done with just one discipline, right? This is really interdisciplinary. So I'd encourage particularly the early career scientists to have conversations with people outside of your discipline and outside of your lab group. This is really where you're going to learn and put different pieces together. And also start thinking outside the box, thinking about what does oncology have that you might be able to learn from, or human health and development? How can we practice, how can we think about things that are just outside of the box? And how can we leverage things like the peak end rule maybe in conservation? So with that, I just wanted to give a little shout out to all my co-authors. Tomorrow morning, if you guys are interested, this paper will be coming out in Science. It's the next kind of step in the bright spots. I originally wanted to be able to present this today, but given the craziness with the crisis and having infant and a toddler at home, there just wasn't time to develop a whole presentation on this new paper. So apologize for that. I'd like to give another talk in the not too distant future, which will focus on this one. So with that, I would just like to say thanks so much to my family, to my SERF team, and to my amazing research group who are just fabulous. So thanks for that, guys. And I think we actually do have some time for questions.